follow on with inverted tongue, from whence does fulfillment come? When I expel from this mortal shell, we're at die for living up. Though you're someone I can't see, cry to me in my dreams.
Hello and good evening. Welcome to the National Town Hall on Restorative Justice for African Americans before and after COVID-19, hosted by the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation's annual legislative conference. I'm Dr. Mena Demise, the Vice President of Policy Analysis and Research and the Leadership Institute, and we want to thank our sponsors at Procter & Gamble for sponsoring this important and necessary discussion. All of you tuning in, thank you. Please join us live with this conversation on Twitter at #CBCFINC and use the hashtag #VirtualALC. This year, 2020, has presented many challenges to the African American community, from disproportionate infection rates of the novel coronavirus to global outcries of justice for the African American community at the hands of law enforcement. Our community continues to wrestle with economic loss, racism, and death. As we explore the disproportionate challenges and opportunities of the current political climate leading up to the presidential election in November, this conversation will resurrect the debate on restorative justice for African Americans in the midst of this global pandemic. Moreover, the Black Lives Matter movement remains alive and well, while the rest of the country continues to awaken to the realities of police brutality, voter suppression, and inequitable access to healthcare, housing, employment, and wealth creation. So with tonight's panel, we ask you to tune in, engage, and participate, and learn how you can play a role in empowering our community. I would now like to introduce this year's conference co-chairs, Congressman Hank Johnson from Georgia and Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence from Michigan. Congressman Hank Johnson is a member of the House Judiciary Committee and Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. He also serves as the chairman of the Judiciary Subcommittee on Courts, Intellectual Property, and the Internet. Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence is also a member of the House Appropriations Committee, serving on the Subcommittee on Transportation and Housing and Urban Development, Subcommittee on Commerce, Justice, Science, and the Subcommittee on Interior Environment. She is also the member on the House Oversight and Reform Committee, where she serves on the Subcommittee on Government Operations and the Subcommittee on National Security. The two of them have been champions for justice. They've done an excellent job leading this annual legislative conference that you all have been tuning into this month. And they are champions for justice across the country in their own right, and we thank them both for their leadership. I'd now like to turn it over to Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence for her remarks.
I want to say good evening. I'm Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence, proudly representing Michigan's 14th Congressional District. Although we can't be together in person, I'm so excited to welcome you to the annual legislative conference for our National Town Hall. Tonight, we will be talking about justice before and after COVID, restorative justice. I want you all to know that the Congressional Black Caucus has been actively fighting and understand that we must be the voice and the conscience of Congress. You have seen our work when we joined together and led in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, where our voice, our history, and our absolute life experiences brought us together to produce that legislation. Economic justice. When we talked about refilling the coffers of so many of our minority business owners, we had to use our voice again to ensure that we mandate that we have economic justice. We all know that this battle is not over and the need in our community is at an all-time high. But I can tell you, when I read the stories and think about my grandmother during the civil rights movement and how she was so powerful in teaching me and engaging the community and being Black and proud, engaging me in understanding that my beauty, that God kissed this skin and made it brown, is relevant, and I have a voice and I have rights. Our work is not done. And we as the Congressional Black Caucus will continue to remind Congress, as my dearly departed friend, my colleague John Lewis used to say, get into good trouble. And I want to thank you all for joining. And I want you to know, every day when you look in your face and see that beautiful brown skin, just know that God has blessed you and we have work to do. Not just for today, but for tomorrow and the next generation. I now want to pass it back to my amazing colleague, the representative who is here from Georgia, Representative Hank Johnson. I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Representative Brenda Lawrence. Big shout out to you. It's been a joy to be your co-lead on this ALC, which has been a challenge to us all. And I want to say hello to everybody out there. I want to thank you for being here, and I want to give a big shout out to our sponsor, Procter & Gamble. We have an amazing array of panelists for our presentation on restorative justice for African Americans before and after COVID-19. We're lucky to have moderator Dr. Julianne Malveaux with us, and with our guest Alicia Garza, Senator Cory Booker, Damon D. Jones, Dr. Kalila L. Brown-Dean, Dr. Derek Hamilton, Opal Tometi, and Kendrick Sampson tonight. This panel will examine strategies to empower Black people to fully realize our unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that have been systematically denied us for hundreds of years. To say 2020 has presented many challenges to the African American community might be the understatement of the century. From disproportionate infection rates of the novel coronavirus to global outcries of justice for African Americans at the hands of law enforcement, the Black community continues to wrestle with economic loss, racism, and death. As we explore the disproportionate challenges and opportunities to the current political climate leading up to the presidential election in November, this conversation will resurrect the debate on restorative justice for African Americans in the midst of a global pandemic. Moreover, Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement remains alive and well, while the rest of the country awakens to the reality that police brutality, voter suppression, and inequitable access to healthcare, education, housing, employment, and wealth creation are the direct result of centuries of official US policy. I look forward to this evening's discussion being lively, enlightening, and truth-telling. Thank you, and on with the program.
Thank you, Congressman, for the introduction and for your opening remarks. I also want to thank my soror, Congresswoman Lawrence, for her words, and she reminds me of a poem that was written by, anyway, I don't remember the author, but it says, she does not know her beauty. She thinks her brown body has no glory. And if she can't dance naked under palm trees, she would know. There are no palm trees on the street, and dishwater gives back no images. The notion of that poem is that we Black women and Black men are not appropriately represented in media. We're not appropriately represented in the Congress or anywhere else. So I honor both of you for your leadership with this ALC, but also for all that you do to make sure that our issues are raised when our Congress doesn't know what they're doing, quite frankly.
And thank you so much, Dr. Malveaux. I want to properly introduce you, so if you will let me intervene right now.
Oh, sorry about that.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to introduce our esteemed moderator for this evening's discussion. She really needs no introduction. She is and has been ubiquitous in American life, chronicling the American experience for African Americans and all of us, really, for decades. As an educator, college president, economist, writer, author, media personality, she is second to none for her insights and progressive observations of politics, society, life, and culture. Brother Cornel West called her the most iconoclastic public intellectual in the country. That's high praise indeed. Her writings and musings have appeared in more newspapers and magazines, and she's appeared on more TV and radio programs offering her insights than I can list here tonight. She's a native San Franciscan. She's currently a director of the Black Doctoral Network and vice chair of the board of EPI. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Malveaux, you may continue.
Forgive me, Congressman. Forgive me for interrupting you. I got excited.
No, it was my bad. It was my bad, but you proceed.
Y'all excite me. Both of y'all excite me. And it excites me to be together, the creativity of turning the CBC into a virtual town hall. We've all had to pivot. We've all had to pivot. And what we know about COVID-19 is that it has literally put a spotlight on what is wrong with our country. It has literally lifted up every disadvantage, every disparity that we see. And I've got a great panel, so I'm going to bringing them into the conversation. I'm going to ask them to answer my questions, but in a couple of minutes so that we can actually have an exchange, because this is a group of people who really must have an exchange. In terms of restorative justice, I do want to tell one anecdote, though. It is important because people talk about enslavement. People talk about post-Reconstruction. What we don't talk about is the actual theft of Black economic power, the actual white economic envy that prevented us from accumulating. There was a Black man in someplace, Georgia, Congressman, someplace, Georgia, I have it written down, I'm getting old. What was that, brother? Anthony P. Crawford, and there was Abbeville, South Carolina. There was another one in Valdosta, Georgia. I've been doing this work, and so I know about too many lynchings. I don't want to know about all these lynchings. But there are more than 5,000. This brother had over 427 acres of what they call good cotton land. The newspapers described him as the Negro, very rich, but insolent for a Negro. Very rich, but insolent for a Negro. He had, the acres he had were worth $20,000 in 1921 or 1916, which meant over $500,000 today. Brother Crawford went to sell his cottonseed in town. The store who bought the cottonseed offered him 5 cents less per pound than they offered a white man. He said, no, I don't want the lower price. I want what you're offering him. There wasn't a melee, and he said he'd rather dump his cottonseed in the damn river, he used the word, the damn river, than to be cheated. He was arrested for cursing a white man. He was arrested, but he had it like that. He had money. He went in his pocket and paid his bail, which was $15 at the time. When they released him, he was beaten, lynched, and killed. And then the two leaders of the lynching, hear me, the two leaders of the lynching were appointed the executors of his estate. Then the city council and these leaders had a vote to expel his family from the town, from Abbeville, South Carolina. So they left their fortune, they left everything they had because they were afraid of also being lynched. This is the part of the restorative justice story that we don't often tell. We've talked about reparations, and thanks to Sheila Jackson Lee and of course the late John Conyers, We've had HR 40 now come before the Congress, now with more than 150 co-sponsors, which I think is amazing. But we have to talk about this land loss, this intimidation, the way that any Black man or woman, but mostly men, who stood up to these devils were lynched, had their property taken from them. We don't have to talk about Black Wall Street or all that. We could, but we don't really have time. But I want folks to know that hidden in our history books, there are all kinds of examples of white economic envy preventing Black progress. So don't ever tell me that Black people are not capable. Tell me that our nation has stolen from us, and all restorative justice is about is the nation giving it back. I want to go immediately, because I understand he has some time constraints, to Senator Cory Booker, who has just been a political rock star since he stepped on the scene as the mayor of Newark, New Jersey. He's been in the Senate. He actually has introduced reparations legislation on the Senate side, which we haven't seen before. We've seen on the House side, but not the Senate side. So we're really excited about the possibility that House and the Senate will be able to look and talk about not only studying reparations, but representing actions about reparations. He's also been a sponsor of the First Step Act. He was joking with us about baby bonds, which I'm going to ask him to explain how baby bonds and other things fit into this issue of restorative justice. Congressman, forgive me, Senator Booker, are you there?
Dr. Malveaux, I am here, and I'm always sincerely humbled and honored to be in your presence. And I know people are looking at you in a public forum, but in private forums, you are so encouraging, so affirming, so challenging when it comes to issues of justice and restorative justice. And it is pretty extraordinary to be on a panel with the people that we have on right now, to Sister Garza, Brother Hamilton, Brother Jones, and of course, Sister Brown, and my two Congress people that were on with me, who are part of, Kamala and I used to always talk when we would cross the Capitol and go over to sit with the Congressional Black Caucus, how affirming it was to our spirit, where we're in a body that hasn't seen that many Black people ever, to be able to join with a circle of people that were heroes to us, many of them like Congressman John Lewis, who's recently passed. I'm glad that this title of this panel is Restorative Justice, because I think we often make the mistake of not focusing on that urgency of restoration. I was very proud, it's already been mentioned, this Justice and Policing Act. And for me, that's not necessarily restorative justice. It's about doing some of the basic things we all should expect from policing in the United States, whether it's transparency, so that everybody from activists to city council people can have better insights into what police departments are doing, who they're stopping, what are the racial demographics, how often they're using force, so that everybody can just ban certain practices that are killing people, whether it's chokeholds that killed Eric Garner, whether it is no-knock warrants that had the murder of Breonna Taylor. And then also just make sure we people are really held accountable, that police are not above the law, and that we get rid of things like immunity for police officers, or reforming Section 242, which allows them to be more held criminally responsible. But there is a problem that I think we have in the larger society, where we reflexively believe that public safety, we make a morally limiting connection between police and public safety. Because real restorative justice is about doing the things that make the police unnecessary, that we know, that even police know, that would make it unnecessary that we are spending, as a guy who actually ran a city, the largest expenditures in our communities are on police. When if we invested in the things that are more like restorative justice, like equal access to health care, like equal access to education, like reinvesting in those communities that have been disproportionately targeted by racist policies, overtly racist policies that have gone on for more than 2 centuries in our country. And an example I want to give before I specifically talk to baby bonds, in 2017, I introduced a bill that I remember how it was greeted. It was the Marijuana Justice Act, which I said very strongly that there's all this talk recently about legalizing marijuana, but we cannot legalize marijuana which has disproportionately been targeting Black communities. I went to Stanford, and there was a wide use of marijuana, but not the kind of policing that we might see in the community in which I live now. There has been more marijuana arrests in recent years than all violent crime arrests combined. Almost 90% of them are for possession. They're disproportionately targeting low-income Black and brown people. And they render a life sentence on people for doing things that 2 of the last 3 presidents admitted to doing. In other words, once you have a criminal conviction, you now, as the American Bar Association points out, have 40,000 collateral consequences in your ability to get a loan, your ability to get a job, and so much more. And so restorative justice is understanding that the drug war has been a war on people, disproportionately Black and brown people, and we don't just need to now suddenly say, okay, marijuana is legal, without saying, wait a minute, we need to reinvest in those communities that have been targeted by these enforcement, which has been systematically racist, and balancing the scale, investing in those communities that have suffered the damages of the unfair or enforcement, or as Michelle Alexander would call it, the new Jim Crow. And so much of my work in the Senate has been about restorative justice, not just curing the problem as it is, but trying to make sure that the damage that has been done for decades, centuries, that we began to correct for those harms and those ills. And so baby bonds is, and one of the geniuses, the intellectual geniuses behind that is on here, Derek Hamilton, is this idea that you create for every child born in America, they get a savings account. Now remember, we use our tax code every year to the tune of over $600 billion to give people with wealth opportunities to compound that wealth. We move things up through our tax code, but we don't do things to help people without wealth to create that wealth. So this is an idea to give everybody born in America an account, and then money is placed in that account every year based upon a family's income. With the lowest income kids, 1 out of every 6 of our children below the poverty line would get the full $2,000 a year. By the time that they are 18, the lowest income kids would have upwards of $50,000 to invest in things that create wealth, buying a home, going to college, starting a business. Now, it is a race-neutral policy, but we designed it in a race-conscious way, knowing that it would have a disproportionate benefit to minority children. As Columbia University says, it would virtually close the racial wealth gap for those children. And so it's ideas like this that create restorative justice that we have to drive. And if, God willing, we get control of the United States Senate and the White House, I am so hopeful, especially because of the groundwork being laid in the House of Representatives by the Congressional Black Caucus and other progressive members. We have a chance to really move this country towards beginning to balance the scales of justice in our country. We have a long way to go, but this is the first time that I've been involved in Congress that I've seen a pathway to do some really bold, game-changing things, like eliminating child poverty or cutting it in half, like starting to do things like our reparations bill or baby bonds bill that really are about restorative justice.
Senator, thank you so very much. And we'll get back to Derek, hopefully, and to have him talk in more detail about the baby bonds. We appreciate your work. You've been so very important in terms of all the work that you've done and in terms of your awareness. I hope that you'll be able to stay with us a little longer so I can get back to you about the anti-urban bias that we're seeing in legislation these days. But let me bring on our sponsor, Damon Jones. He is he's with Procter & Gamble. He leads the Procter & Gamble brand, really, the brand and corporate communications. And he's been leveraging their industry presence for a very long time. He looks at the work of women, people of color, and other underrepresented groups. He's a trusted advisor to the C-suite, and he has a proven track record of leveraging reputation and relationship. We're happy that Procter & Gamble's agreed to sponsor this. P&G has had a very positive reputation in terms of its engagement. The Underground Railroad Museum, which is in Cincinnati, they were a major sponsor of, and we're very grateful for that. There's always a tension though. So I want to ask Damon, what is the corporate role in this issue of restorative justice? What can corporations do, understanding that their bottom line has to be their bottom line?
Well, I think we do not succeed as a company unless the people that we serve succeed. So I think for us, this is about stepping up and leading and recognizing that, as Senator Booker and others said, there are institutions that have not been equal for many people in this country. And we can't begin to address some of those issues until we can begin to have the conversation about the problems that we have. So one of the ways that we've been trying to step up is really using our position as one of the world's leading advertisers to really bring focus and bring attention on issues of racial injustice, on systemic racism, on gender inequality. So the film that we saw even at the top of this hour was a film that we put out called The Choice. And it was designed really to get more people off the sidelines and into the game when it came to equality. What we noticed is that many of the communications that were in the marketplace were frankly preaching to the choir. We were preaching to more Black and brown people about what needed to change. Well, the reality of it is we're not going to drive equality until we bring the majority community into this discussion, right? So The Choice was directly talking to that silent majority, saying, hey, it's not enough to not be racist. You need to be actively anti-racist. You need to be aware of the policies in healthcare and in education and in employment that are not allowing equality. And then we need to step up and do something about it. So for us, it's a continuation of a long track record of calling attention to that, using our position as a $70-some billion company to shine the light on it, but also make sure that we're stepping up and walking the talk. And that means how we treat our employees, how we leverage our brands to make sure that we're creating wealth in the Black community through a variety of not just supplier diversity programs and handouts, but really creating sustained economic justice and just really stepping up and trying to be a beacon for that. So that to me is the role of businesses. Step up, use your power, use your influence to drive attention to these issues, but more importantly, to walk the talk.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you a follow-up question because P&G certainly has been a leader in this area. Many corporations are simply silent. I live off of 14th Street in Washington, D.C. So if I walk down the street, every store has a Black Lives Matter sign. But these are stores that I've experienced unequal treatment at, others have experienced unequal treatment at. I say the Black Lives Matter sign are really like don't break my window signs. But in any case, P&G is at the forefront, many are not. What does your CEO or others in your C-suite say to their colleagues about restorative justice?
Well, I mean, I think, I'll go back to many of the conversations that I've had with David Taylor, who's our CEO. And I think, this is not something that he delegates down to a certain department or to a few people to say, hey, go off and do this program. It takes a deep understanding of the institutions that have created inequality to really understand how we go about doing it, right? So I think, you've got to recognize it. You've got to pull your peers in. One of the things that David's doing along with a number of other CEOs is banding together with other companies, right? Because there's an impact that Procter & Gamble can have. But imagine if we bring in hundreds of other CEOs. So we band together with PwC and other companies. You get 1,000 CEOs now in a group called the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion. Together, we're now looking at what are we doing together, because again, equality isn't a game where we compete. It's something where we need to collaborate. And so I think that's the type of approach, and just, again, calling it out, recognizing what we can do, but making it personal, and then really following through to hold the accountability in our systems, the systems of our partners, and the systems of our suppliers, again, recognizing and lending that privilege.
Thank you so much, David. I appreciate that. And we appreciate your sponsorship. And by the way, the video was excellent, provocative, thought-provoking. And I hope that lots of people will take a look at it. Let me bring Alicia Garza in. She is an Oakland-based organizer, writer, public speaker, and freedom dreamer. That's a great description of her. One of the founders of Black Lives Matter, formerly an activist, organizer with the Domestic Workers Alliance, the voice for domestic workers who are all too often ignored. Alicia, Black Lives Matter has really gotten so much momentum in the past several months on both sides. Clearly, lots of folks taking it to the streets in protest of George Floyd and so many others who have been murdered, but also more recognition from the other side who have attempted to portray the movement as terrorists, which is just a lie. but that's what they try to do anyway. Tell me what you think about how Black Lives Matter goes forward. What's next for you? Alicia.
Well, Dr. Malvo, thank you so much for asking this question. It's very important. And I'm glad to be here with all of my esteemed colleagues, all of you whom I look up to in a serious way. I want to just start off by saying that, you know, obviously 4 years ago, it was political poison to talk about Black Lives Matter. And even though many of the folks here on this panel have always believed and have championed that Black Lives Matter, when it actually comes to changing rules and making new rules that would allow for that to happen, we weren't able to even get into a conversation about why we were talking about Black Lives Matter. And in fact, we saw all kinds of responses to Black Lives Matter. We saw All Lives Matter. We saw Blue Lives Matter. I even saw things like Dogs Lives Matter. And I think that that should give us a really clear sense of how deeply entrenched racism is in every structure of our society. You know, we opened up this conversation by talking about restorative justice and talking about reparations. And I think it's important for us to just acknowledge that we can't actually get to any of those steps if we don't even acknowledge that harm is being caused. And so what we're seeing right now is really a backlash, not to sweeping changes to make Black Lives Matter, but we're seeing a backlash even to the acknowledgement, right, that Black lives have not mattered since Black people were brought to this country in the bottoms of boats, chained to each other. I think that the future of this movement is deeply tied to the beginning of it. And, you know, oftentimes people say, okay, you're the founder of Black Lives Matter, the movement or the organization or however you want to cut it. And I often tell people, you know, this movement is much older and much bigger than me. And this movement has been around much longer than me. We are simply a tributary of a long river, as our brother Vincent Harding used to say, of struggle for freedom and liberation. But this tributary, I think, is unique in the course of history because we are certainly existing in this moment and teetering on the cliff of what I think we could commonly just call fascism. And so while 4 years ago we were having a hard time even saying Black Lives Matter, many were, not people here on this panel, I think we're in a moment now where to utter that Black Lives Matter without even talking about the rules that we need to change, are literally bringing threats of violence and racial terror. But it's threatening to actually solidify that practice once again as the practice of this nation. And so to me, what's incredible is that this movement is no longer just being shared among people who have already agreed for a long time that Black lives must matter in order for this country to reach the promise that it has always offered to Black people and all people in this nation. But I think that there's something here that we have to consider, which is that in order for us to see a future for this movement, one of the cornerstones of that ability to progress is to even acknowledge, right, that harm is being done and that harm has been done. And I think that the other thing that is necessary, quite frankly, is for us to not just see Black Lives Matter as a Black person's issue. And I say this in particular because 4 years ago, and I use 4 years as a marker because it was the last time we were in an election cycle of this magnitude. But, you know, I have to say that 4 years ago, quite frankly, you know, the resistance to this had a lot to do with, you know, people who were not Black saying, well, I don't see myself in this, right? So in that sense of things, making Black Lives Matter was something that Black people cared about. It was a good or a nice thing to do for Black people, but people couldn't see for themselves who were not Black how Black Lives Matter actually impacted and influenced their lives. I think in this moment, people are starting to see Black Lives Matter is certainly about police violence and police brutality, but it's also very much about fighting back against racial terror. It's also very much about fighting for the things that we all need to live well: better healthcare, access to affordable and quality housing, access to quality education, an economic system that allows people to live with wellness and dignity. And so that creates a possibility for this movement that I think we didn't see 4 years ago, which is to bring together silos of people, whether it be racially, geographically, across lines of sexuality or any other lines, to say Black Lives Matter means all of us. It's not just about, and it's never been about charity for Black people. It's been about creating the kind of nation and creating the kind of globe that allows us to live as a global and interconnected community, as we certainly are.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that futuristic perspective. I failed to mention that you're the head of the Black Futures Lab, and you have this survey with like 30,000 Black people in it.
That's correct.
Provides us with lots of information about the diversity in the African American community. And Dr. James Johnson, I believe, just passed. He was at the University of Michigan, and he was the first one to talk about surveying within the African American community and looking at the differences among us. Usually social science research focuses on Black-white differences, but it's important for us to also understand the heterogeneity that exists in our community. And so your work basically was a worthy follow-up to the work that he did back in the early 80s. So thank you for that as well.
Thank you.
Since you talk about economic issues, I want to bring in Derek Hamilton. He is a bud, a friend, but also one of the leading economists looking at racial disparity. He is the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy at the New School for Social Research and the director of a newly created institute for the study of race, stratification, and political economy at the New School. That's a mouthful, Derek. He has really written a lot about the disparities that exist, and I want him to take us from the disparities to reparations. To start by talking about disparities, but then to take us to reparations. How can we basically have a sustainable reparations movement that lots of people will embrace? And for full disclosure, I am a commissioner of NARC, the National African American Reparations Commission, and we've been doing work all over the country. I had the privilege of testifying in Congress about HR 40. I don't know if I was well behaved, but I did actually. It was an honor to be able to do that. So Derek, take us from disparities to reparations and baby bonds. Derek Hamilton, are you here?
Unmute yourself, man.
I'm here and muted. So let me say
that's unacceptable. It's unacceptable for you to try to be muted. And I want the haircut.
Well, first, gratitude and honor for being on this stage with all of you. And I mean that with sincerity. Sometimes we say that pro forma, but I especially mean that with this group and really from my heart. Let me offer one correction, Dr. Malveaux, and that is it's James Jackson, who passed away at the University of Michigan. And I'm glad you singled him out because I think it's relevant to this conversation as well. James was unapologetically Black and unapologetically a scholar. Those two combinations are things that I personally try to emulate. And you know, he was at University of Michigan when there was straight up apartheid in the academy. And when I say unapologetically Black and unapologetically a scholar, he didn't take breadcrumbs. He aimed and was a visionary and sought big, grandiose things. And you pointed out correctly, he was one of the few scholars to be able to do a study that was exclusively focused on Black people with the National Survey of Black Americans and the National Survey of American Life, and saying that it is okay to study Black people and try to address their needs. I'd say that the answer to the question is related to a lot of Alicia's answer as well, which is when we talk about race, it is not exclusively for Black people. We need to recognize that our political economy has three pillars. There's economics, there's politics, and there's also race. Our response to COVID-19 is very racialized. If the essential workers, if the face of essential workers were different than they were, I suspect Congress might have had a different response to what it meant to have protective equipment. I think that our ability for government intervention is largely related to how we think about poverty and inequality. So if we were to have a full-throated truth and reconciliation in America and have that sobering conversation, we would understand that Black, white, Asian, Latinx, indigenous, poverty itself is rooted in resource deprivation, not attitudes, norms, or behaviors. And if we need only look at Black people to come to that conclusion and understand. So, I'd say that they're parallel related, but somewhat mutually exclusive avenues towards justice. There's racial justice as well as economic justice. So when we talk about reparations, it has both racial and economic justice element, but it's really tilted towards race. It's again, starting with a truth and reconciliation to restore dignity, to have the apology, for the US government to have the full-throated acknowledgement of all the complicity that has taken place with regards to extraction and exploitation of Black resources and Black bodies, Black lives themselves. That is necessary, but it's not enough. It would also entail some redress. And the truth and reconciliation without redress is somewhat empty. I mean, to give an example, South Africa went through truth and reconciliation, but gross inequality still persists. So there was a peaceful transition post-apartheid, but they still need to do the redress part. But that said, reparations is not enough for justice in America. Reparations would be a retrospective, necessary condition if we're ever going to get beyond the original sin, which is slavery, but beyond just slavery, all the sharecropping, Jim Crow, all the lynching that you referenced earlier. We need that truth and reconciliation and redress if America's ever going to get beyond race. But that said, prospectively, we know that politics and economics has a tendency to consolidate, iterate, and accumulate at the top to the exclusion of others. So we also need policies like baby bonds that are prospective, that ensure that everybody has access to capital as a birthright, irrespective of their race or their gender. We know that there's patriarchy in our society. Even within family, we make decisions about which offspring we're going to leave a bequest to. Baby bonds would give a birthright where the state is saying that you as an individual will make sure that you have some access to capital. So I think we need parallel policies of both race-specific reparations, as well as something, we need a framework of an economic rights framework that makes the case that political rights, civil rights are not enough, that there are necessary economic conditions that people need if they want to thrive in their life. You need food if you want to have a right to choose. Simple as that. The right to choose, the right to protest becomes somewhat irrelevant to somebody who's hungry, to someone who doesn't have shelter. So things like the right to learn, a right to schooling from grade school all the way through college, the right to housing, decent housing, the right to capital, the right to income, the right to a job. The state has a role to play to ensure that it's being facilitated and that people are not at the whim of a profit maximizing fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, where an entity may reduce output in order to maximize profit, or charge higher prices in order to maximize profit.
Great. Thank you for taking us from the disparity to the baby bonds to reparations. And it's a really important point. We'll try to get back to this later, but there's a difference between reparations and good public policy. And I think we have to make a point about that. If we're talking about economic justice, that's different from reparations in so many ways. I mean, when someone says, I'm going to put some money into housing, that's not reparations, that's good public policy. Everybody deserves to have housing. When you say I'm going to hire some Black people, well, you should hire some Black people. That's not reparations, that's good public policy. But a lot of people have put everything in a reparations bag. Like all this stuff is reparations, and it isn't. And we have to be careful, especially as economists, to make a very clear distinction between those things. quick response if you have one.
I mean, I agree, right? And I think that's part of the point, that even if we were to implement reparations in a full-throated way, that does nothing prospectively to the dynamism that's always going to take place in an economy without government intervention. That we need both parallel frames. And then the last part is, even if we do that good public policy that you mentioned, we are never going to get beyond our race problem until we're ready and we actually implement a full-throated reparations program.
Absolutely. Thank you, Derek. I appreciate you. Our next panelist is Dr. Kalila Brown-Dean. She's Associate Professor of Political Science and Senior Director of Inclusive Excellence at Quinnipiac University, where we get all of our great studies, our great polls about the presidency. She's author of a book, Identity Politics in the United States. She's an award-winning scholar, just accomplished author, so many things. This is an amazing sister that has contributed not only to academic life, but to other life, and supported by the Ford Foundation, the Open Society Foundation, and others. So I want to ask her to look at this identity politics issue in the context of restorative justice. I mean, if you're looking at identity politics, you'll see lots of folks who say, I didn't have any slaves. My people were also oppressed. Help us with how identity politics help us get to racial economic justice.
You know, I think in our current public square, when we hear the term identity politics, it's used in this pejorative way. It's what other people do, particularly people that we don't think deserve to name and affirm what they need and what they are entitled to. But everything about this country is built on identity. From the very founding of this country, it was about that tension of who gets to decide who's at the table or who can raise their voices. And so it's not lost on me that while people deny that history or that tension over identity, that today, September 15th, we honor those 4 little girls who were killed in the 16th Street Church because someone believed that their identity and their lives did not matter. And while people say that was something that my ancestors did, let's just get over history, why then are we seeing these battles in the streets over statues to Columbus or over Confederate monuments or even the very name of my small hometown in Virginia? And so that legacy of using Black bodies to produce wealth for other folks didn't end with the 13th Amendment. Because right now, as we gather tonight, there are Black and brown inmates fighting fires in California for folks who want to protect their property without ever affirming their lives. Not addressing that those very same incarcerated people will be used in a census count to generate wealth and resources for communities that they never could live in. That our friends who are in Louisiana and in Mississippi and are so concerned about how yet another storm will affect them, that many of the people who are on the front line are incarcerated people who, once again, as we saw on flooded out highways after Hurricane Katrina, get their bodies discarded even after their labor has been exploited. And so the very essence of identity politics is about understanding those ongoing battles and tensions. But also, as you know, my grandmother used to say, sometimes you have to call a thing a thing. So when you hear the language of the suburbs and this fear that people are coming for the suburbs because they dare say that access to quality housing is a civil right, that's not even a dog whistle, because a dog whistle is subtle. That is a direct appeal to say, right, that some folks do not deserve to have the most basic things that they need in order to be safe, in order to provide for their families. And so understanding economic justice, understanding restorative justice, Dr. Malveaux, requires that we reframe and redefine what we mean by justice at its very core. That yes, the family of Breonna Taylor deserves every dollar of that 12 million times a million. But that is not justice to do what you are supposed to do. That is a first step in acknowledgement that will only come when that family gets to decide what justice looks like, what it feels like, and what justice sounds like when we understand that commitment.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that insight around identity politics and for mentioning the 4 little girls, which of course, this is a day where they were massacred by crazy white people. And it's not that their ancestors did it, it's that other people are still doing that today. When a police officer takes a little girl by her braids and drags her somewhere or any of that, it's really the same thing. I want to get back to Senator Booker because he had a slight time constraint. I'm glad that he's still with us. Senator, I want to talk to you a little bit about anti-urban policy or anti-urban attitudes. You were the mayor of Newark. And of course, a plurality of Black people live in large urban areas. But we've just seen this administration say, if you don't send your kids back to school, I'm going to cut your education funds, even though we know that in some cases it's not safe and the education funds are being used to support virtual teachers. The language that our professor sister here has lifted up, just, I can't even call it the White House. I call it the house that enslaved people built, because it just needs to, we need to remind ourselves that, no, it's the people's house. But in any case, yesterday, talking about denying federal funds to cities that have been turned over to terrorists. Senator Booker, tell me what you think about that. And as a senator, what can you do about it? Can we really actually see urban funds being cut?
So I think a lot of the points that Alicia Garza was making and Dr. Brown-Dean really hit home with me, because I think that there is this pervasive lie in America about what the realities people are experiencing. And it's creating this savage poverty of empathy as the lie pervades as the truth. And people are failing to see the urgency of the matter. And so here you have constant noise about terrorists, but all the intelligence information that we see knows that the greatest terrorism that we've seen in America, with the largest people being killed, are white supremacist terrorists in our country. More so since 9/11 than terrorists from outside of our country, and more so than any of the terrorists that Donald Trump seems to focus on. And we in fact see with whistleblowers now, seeing that they were trying to actively alter the truth, which unfortunately is a threat to Americans, whether you live in the suburbs, as we saw with attacks on synagogues and attacks on churches, or wherever you live. And I think that the 2 women on our panel were profound in trying to understand, when we say Black Lives Matter, there is a more fullness to that than even what the press wants to cover about that issue. And so for living in a city for the last 20 years and watching that Black children die of asthma complications at 10 times the rate that a white child dies, that my Black women die in childbirth at almost 4 times the rate of white women in a country that already leads the industrial world in overall maternal mortality. That the number one indicator, I live within 5 miles of 2 Superfund sites, that the number one indicator of whether you live around toxicity, which is violence against your body, is the color of your skin. When there's more than 3,000 jurisdictions where children have more than twice the blood lead level of Flint, Michigan, and yet our nation does not want to make the basic low infrastructure costs it would to replace lead service lines. There are so many ways in which Black bodies are under assault in this country that when you say Black Lives Matter, the limited way in which people are viewing that is ignoring the truth of the wretched injustices that are being heaped upon people simply because of the color of their skin. And what bothered me as a mayor for a long time is, number one, people having often the amnesia of history to not even know how the urban space of Newark, New Jersey, and so many other cities even got created in the first place. It was not implicit racial bias. It was not structural racism simply. It was overtly racist policies that redlined communities, devalued communities, put all the low-income housing concentrated in certain areas, heaped upon communities that are urban areas, social goods that, like, we have the incinerator in New Jersey, in our city, all the major highways that we ripped up neighborhoods to put them through cities, or what causes the respiratory diseases. And yet I would argue to people who say, well, all my tax dollars go into the inner city, and I'd be like, I don't understand what you're talking about. Number one, most of the land in our city, because of the public goods we provide, is tax exempt, because all the universities are there, and more. And so we are missing the conception of the domestic emerging markets that we have. That the entrepreneurs in my city, if African American entrepreneurs just had the same fair access to capital. Remember, there was an oversight group that looked at the PPP loans and had a black person and a white person with the same bio, the same financial backing, and they had dramatically different experiences when they walked into banks. If African Americans had the same access to capital, our whole economy would do better by about $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion, according to McKinsey. And so, when I was mayor of the city of Newark, I was not looking for charity. I was looking for people to understand their enlightened self-interest, and to rid themselves of that poverty of empathy, to let them understand the restorative justice that was owed to communities. I'm going to finish with two things, because I do have to jump. But one is, literally, my father was attacked when he tried to move into the suburbs of New Jersey. Had to get a white couple that poses them to buy the house that I grew up in. It shows you, up until the late 60s, early 70s, the forcible denial of opportunity to African Americans for wealth and opportunity. And now the calling, and this is why I'm so appreciative of activists in our country right now, is because in the Senate, when you say, what can we do in the Senate? Look, the Justice and Policing Bill wouldn't have even been possible 6 months before. I could never have gotten, Kamala and I could have never gotten close to 40 senators on it if it wasn't for the activists that took to the streets and shifted the consciousness of our country. Not to fully where it needs to go, but when the best-selling books on the New York Times, Amazon bestseller list are all about issues of racism and issues of racial justice, it begins to show that someone is helping to expand the understanding of what's going on in our country. And so there are a lot of senators and definitely the Congressional Black Caucus that have visions for this country, and it's not even that complicated. Dear God, if we just expanded the child tax credit and made it fully refundable, you cut black poverty in this country in half. This is not that hard or expensive. But what is necessary for us to get this done is for us to make sure that activism in our communities, that has been a necessary precondition for every great piece of legislation that has been passed in our country, Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, I can go through them all, was always it was always preceded by great levels of activism and engagement by people demanding the change that ultimately was made in Washington. And so that's really what we need right now. Number one is this election, the participation has to be high levels. And I know the demographics in Georgia, where 2 Senate seats are up, in North Carolina, where there's a Senate seat, in South Carolina, where there's a Senate seat. I know the power. I know the difference it makes by having a Kamala Harris in the Senate or not having a Kamala Harris in the Senate, because lived experiences matter. And to only have in the history of the United States 2 black women ever to serve in the United States Senate. When I got to the Senate, to working with Chuck Schumer, who was the person who just poked his head in a few moments ago, and went to him and said, this is the least diverse place I've ever worked, and getting him to literally force every Democratic senator to publish the diversity statistics of their staff. Now that's going on for 4 years, the number of people of diversity in the room when it happens has gone up dramatically. These things matter. And so this must be the season again of activism. It must be the season again of us exercising the truth that the power of the people is greater than the people in power. If we can do that, and it's not over on election day, dear God, I'm sorry, beating Donald Trump gets us out of a valley. It does not get us to the mountaintop. We need to elect people, and then we need to hold them accountable for doing the things that have to be done, so that Derek is not sitting with me 4 or 5 years ago, still with his big hair, making me all jealous. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, he has promised me if we pass some major legislation that he's going to shave his head. So for that reason, I am praying that the activism of this country and a whole bunch of other reasons that are about justice and love and decency, we have got to move our country. And the final point I just want to drive home is it's not just for the sake of one group. When African Americans, when disadvantaged populations get fairness and justice, everyone's well-being, everyone's thriving, goes significantly up in this country. And we know that. When John F. Kennedy pointed to the moon as a destination, it was only when Black women came to the table and were able to make contributions that we were able to achieve the impossible things. We've got to have inclusive justice in this country. We've got to have restorative justice. And Sister Malveaux, Dr. Malveaux, thank you for allowing me a few moments to be on a panel of luminaries.
We appreciate you so much. Thank you for taking, I know that y'all are busy, so thanks for taking the time to be with us, and thanks for your contributions.
No, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
So Senator Booker has dropped some knowledge, some serious knowledge on us, and we're grateful for that. And we don't have a lot of time left. We have about 25 minutes. So we're gonna move on, and with gratitude that he's been with us. I want to go back to Alicia, because people are popping up in the comments area. We're really asking questions about what's next, not only what's next, raising questions about Black Lives Matter and its relationship to the legislative process. Senator Booker just mentioned that we wouldn't have the George Floyd bill if there had not been activism, but is there more that BLM can do? And I know that Black Lives Matter is a very diffuse movement. Folk all over the place are doing their thing in different kind of ways, which makes a lot of sense. You know, you don't want to have one leader that gets assassinated and then you're back to ground zero. But, you know, in terms of things like coordination around legislation, help us out with that. What more could you do? What are you looking at, especially around health issues? Because Black health matters. Black mental health matters, which we're not paying enough attention to. Nearly half of those who are harassed, beaten, whatever, by the police have mental health issues. They should be seen by social workers, not by crazy people with nightsticks. I'm editorializing. Alicia?
Yeah, it's okay. You're telling the truth. So continue to editorialize. Let me reframe this question a little bit, because I get this all the time. And I think it's important for us to approach this from a different perspective. I certainly think that a healthy and well-functioning democracy requires governance of and by the people. And unfortunately, I think so many of us kind of do a thing, right, where we say, okay, well, it's somebody else's job. It's somebody else's job to do that. It's somebody else's job to fix that. It's somebody else's job to come up with that. And I want to make sure that as we talk about kind of the future of the movement, and I'm happy to talk about the Breathe Act, which is an incredibly comprehensive piece of legislation that the Movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter has been talking with members of the CBC and other members of Congress about. I'm happy to talk about the Black Agenda 2020, which we developed and released in February, that is a relatively comprehensive legislative roadmap of how we make Black Lives Matter from City Hall all the way up to Congress. So I make this point, Dr. Malveaux, because I think, you know, some of what we hear, right, is, well, what else are these activists doing besides marching? And I want to make it very clear that I think for a lot of us, we'd probably prefer to stay in our homes during a pandemic. We would probably prefer not to have to put our bodies at risk and on the line. But unfortunately, right, not only the conditions that we're living in our communities are sorely lacking as it relates to progress, but sometimes, and no disrespect to the Congress people who are on this panel, but sometimes our government also does not function in such a way, right, where there is active engagement and participation with constituencies who are experiencing this level of duress. And I can say this quite frankly and quite honestly, this movement certainly has done and continues to do its work, not just to raise the consciousness of this country and sometimes our own communities about what it is that we deserve and where it is that we are lacking in what we deserve. But I think we've also done a relatively sharp job of making sure that we are also proposing solutions. And so I offer this reframing because I think sometimes activists get a bad rap, quite frankly. Being an activist is not just about marching and protesting in the streets. I do have my bullhorn here and I've got all my protest gear, but I also have a relative knowledge, right? And deep engagement with my legislators, including my Congresswoman Barbara Lee, around legislative solutions that we want to see happening in our communities. As it relates to the BREATHE Act, and I want to spend a couple of minutes or a couple seconds on this, because I think it's deeply important. This movement has spent the last 7 years, not just raising the consciousness around the issues that we're facing, but also proposing concrete solutions as to what we can do about it. There are some elements from the Justice and Policing Act that are included in BREATHE, but also BREATHE does go a little bit farther, and it fundamentally says, we have to divest our resources from the punishment economy that we have been invested in since the beginning of this country. And we have to reinvest our resources into systems, structures, rules that allow for our communities to live more well, more whole, and with more dignity. I can also say that as of yet, we're experiencing a lot of resistance even in getting somebody to introduce this legislation. So for the folks who are watching, who are asking about what the movement is doing to create new rules, I would say please call your congressperson and ask them to introduce the BREATHE Act, because certainly there are some incredibly comprehensive proposals. I would say comprehensive to the level of the 1965 Civil Rights Act that is trying to address the issues of this day, not just around policing and the punishment economy, but what it would mean to reinvest in an economy that actually valued Black people. You can also go and visit the Black Agenda 2020. You can find it on our website at black2thefuture.org, where we took the data from the census project that we did, which is the largest survey of Black people in America in 155 years, and we translated what it is that more than 30,000 Black people from all 50 states, all incomes, all demographics said about what legislative solutions we wanted to see, and we translated that into a legislative roadmap. We also put together a plan for recovery and relief for Black America as it relates to COVID-19. You can also find that on our website at black2thefuture.org, where we lay out what it would take for Black people to get relief legislatively from the impacts of this pandemic and what it would mean for Black communities to recover both from the pandemic but also moving forward. So again, I do want to just make sure that folks know activism is happening not just in the streets, but it's also happening in city halls and state legislatures and in Congress. And we need your help to help make sure that those efforts are being lifted.
Great, thank you very much. And folks, check out the website. You just check out the website. Derek, I'm going to come to you for an economic question that came from one of the audience people. We know that this system was basically founded on exploitation of people. So we have an audience member who's asked about exploitation in college athletics. Now, I don't want a dissertation, but I know you have thoughts about this, and I'd like you to talk a bit about how the coaches and the colleges make all the money, and the young people who are usually African-American sometimes are living on as little as $300 a month. What do you say?
I mean, you just said it. I think that's very problematic. It's exploitive. But maybe there's some innovation that's taking place as well. I know that, for example, I have a colleague from Oberlin College who's also a sports commentator, Chris Broussard, who has encouraged athletes to take some agency and even think about going to HBCUs, especially if you know you're a one and done. Imagine if you're a one and done, you have some power in this relationship. A lot of things are about power. So you can imagine some athletes don't have a great deal of power in these relationships. But if we want to impose rules of one and done that require you to go to college, we should consider what type of agency we have and think about how we want to use that agency to empower ourselves. And athletes very well may be in a position to do something about system of exploitation and extraction.
Great, thank you I knew you had an answer. I knew you had an answer.
I pulled that one out, Julianne. I didn't have that one prepared.
I know I pulled it out of a hat, but someone else had asked a question. I thought we should address it. I want to go to Dr. Brown-Dean. Much of your work talks about incarceration, the prison industrial complex, injustice there. What should we, when we talk about restorative justice, what should we be doing to reform the justice system? We've got the George Floyd Act, and we've just heard about the Breathe Act, but what would you add to the conversation about what we need to do? Because, you know, half of those folks who are incarcerated are African-American men.
I think one of the most important things we need to do is how we keep people out of that system. Once you are entrapped in that system, it is very difficult to stay out of it for a host of reasons, not the least of which is because we have an incentive to make more money if you return. Think about how many Black kids are not connected in person to school right now. And when you see a story about a young Black girl who has to go before a judge because she didn't log in to do her homework, that criminalization of Black youth, the exploitation of Black youth. And while yes, Black men are disproportionately represented in that, Black women now represent the fastest growing prison population in this country, which means more Black mothers going into prison, more Black children going into foster care. And we all know that Black children and older children are less likely to be adopted out and are most likely to take on a whole host of behaviors and challenges that then puts them at risk. That's the piece of it that I think, unfortunately, we can have a conversation about a second chance society when it comes to restorative justice. But we have to be honest that most folks have never had a viable first chance. And that's not just the people that we get to paint as other or pit victims against perpetrators. It's about understanding that in many of our communities, both factions live in the same home or in the same neighborhood. And why does that happen? That's about restorative justice, acknowledging humanity and dignity, and then investing in it because we understand the value of people.
Thank you. I want to bring Damon back into the conversation. You know, I always tiptoe around my corporate friends because sometimes y'all can say and some things y'all can't say.
Don't tiptoe, don't tiptoe. We're among family tonight, so let's have that conversation.
Well, actually, what I'd like to hear from you is some feedback on what you've heard from others. And again, what P&G and other corporations can do to help folks like Alicia and others who have an agenda, to help that agenda get implemented. I know that y'all pay, not just y'all, corporate America spends millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in lobbying. Mm-hmm. Are they prepared to put money into lobbying for the George Floyd Act or the Breathe Act?
Well, I think there's a range of things. I mean, you've just mentioned two of them, but there are many different things out there that I do think require companies to step up. I mean, if you look at, you know, at the end of the day, we are in the business of serving consumers, and we know that trust in government has gone down for many different reasons. And there's expectations that businesses do step up and fill the gap, candidly, right? So we can't do it alone. We have to work in partnership with people like Alicia and all of our panelists out there. That means that we also need to be putting our money where our mouth is, both with our lobbying, but also with the groups and the NGOs that we're funding, right? I mean, I think, you know, the journals reported that there's been, you know, billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars that have been, you know, sent from corporate America into various nonprofits in the wake of George Floyd, right? You know, we need to make sure that we're just not writing checks to assuage that guilt, but that we're really making that money work hard, right? So that means not just looking at some of the big organizations, looking at some of the smaller organizations, not finding the charities that are easy and comfortable to donate to, but are we getting into the topics like police community relations? Are we getting into topics that talk about, bias that exists in a number of our systems, whether it's the images that we see? I mean, one of the things that we're trying to do more is paying a lot more attention to what are the images that people see when they turn into their televisions every night, right? If you're only seeing Black women and Black men in certain storylines and portrayed in certain ways in advertising, then that seeds bias in what you believe, right? So that's a way that we can simply just change what we do and how we do it to make sure that we are accurately and respectfully portraying all people, because we know that those images matter, and that impacts not only how people see themselves, it impacts how people see each other. So I do think it's a full range of things, but like you said, there is a role to play when it comes to lobbying. There's a role when it comes to play to the economic aspects of that. Again, how, I think one of the things people should be asking, if you were working at a company, you should be going into that company and saying, hey, talk to me about, how many Black suppliers do we have, right? Creating that long-term wealth. Not just how many Black people do we have, how are we recruiting? How are we promoting? How are we advancing? Do we have money at Black banks? So these are all the types of discussions that we're having with inside P&G, and that I think other companies should be having within, because that makes it a part of fundamentally how you do business. You don't get credit for doing the things that you should be doing anyway. So start by doing those things and then build on to some of these the things that we've talked about tonight.
Well, one more question. Now I'm really going to put you on the spot.
Okay.
Not really, but kind of. So we have Black Lives Matter on one hand, very important organization raising lots of consciousness. And then you have the NRA. Y'all support, I will ask you, do you support the NRA? But, everybody buys P&G stuff because your stuff is ubiquitous. How do you balance the interests of various constituencies? BLM, the NRA.
Well, I can say that we don't support the NRA with any of our dollars. I can say that confidently. What I will say, just to clear that up, but what I do think is we've got to be clear on what are the values that we live by, right? We believe in equity and we believe in equality. And when we go out with messages that promote those things, we know very clearly not everyone is going to agree. A few years ago, we put out an ad called The Talk. And The Talk was a short film that talked about the conversations that Black parents have to have with their children about the realities of being Black in America. There were people who came out of the woodwork that said, you know what, you guys are race baiting, you're being more divisive. That was a conversation that I'm willing to bet that the majority of the people on this panel tonight had with their parents or have had with someone in their family. So just because it's not everyone's reality doesn't take away that it was the reality for some people. And part of our job is to make sure that everyone is seen, those stories are told. And so this is not a popularity contest. And if we lose a few consumers along the way, then I think we're okay with that. But we need to look at ourselves in the mirror at the end of the day and say, have we done right by all of our employees, by all of our consumers? And at the end of the day, what Senator Booker says is when we get more equality, when we have Black people fully participating in this economy, when we have women fully participating in this economy, in equitable ways, that's good for business, right? So this isn't about charity or doing something else. I mean, equality is fundamentally good for business, and that's something that every business should be interested in.
Great. I see why you're the head of corporate communications. You're pretty slick. Okay, folks, my clock is running down, which means that y'all get like a minute or so, but really a minute, to leave us with some closing thoughts, remarks. And Derek, I'm gonna start with you.
Well, first, let me put a little rebuttal to the previous answer I gave about athletes. We saw with the NBA that through collective action, they were able to achieve something with the threat of a strike. So even thinking about college athletes, if they are to organize and act as a unit, they would have more power than they do individually. So I would suggest they consider some organization strategy. The thing I want to leave everybody with is this was about COVID-19 and restorative justice from COVID-19. We saw clearly that Black people were more harmed in terms of their physical, mental, and economic conditions as a result of COVID-19. And that was, we use the rhetoric of precondition, but preconditions are preconditioned by other things, which is a history that has extracted and exploited from Black people, both in terms of when they were able to accumulate resources, as well as public policy directed at them. So they were left more vulnerable. What is really pernicious is that when you have something like a pandemic that's seemingly random, that is so related and linked to one's identity, that's indicative of a nation that's failing and immoral.
Great. Thank you, thank you. Alicia, your closing minute.
With my closing minute, I just want to encourage folks to check out the work that folks are doing to change the rules that have been rigged against our communities for a very long time. I couldn't agree more with Dr. Brown-Dean in the relationship to, you know, we want to make sure that everybody has a full shot from the beginning, not just when there's tragedies that have happened. There's an opportunity for us to not have to go backwards, but instead to keep putting one foot in front of the other. If you want to check out more about what our movement is up to, certainly check out the movementforblacklives.org. You can check out blacklivesmatter.com. You can check out blacktothefuture.org, where you can find the Black Agenda 2020. And you can also find the COVID-19 Relief and Recovery Plan for Black America. You can also sign on to our Black Agenda, and you can join more than 60,000 Black voters across the country in using this tool to determine who you will choose to represent you in November. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. Dr. Brown-Dean.
I would just say that we need to be reminded that fear is a powerful force in politics, but we also need to remember that we are a people who are not born out of fear. And so for all that is swirling in this country, all that may come, I want people to remember their power, to reclaim and affirm that power. I want people to protect their peace, guard it fiercely, because we know that what we're facing in this country is not new for Black folks, but we deserve every good thing like anyone else. So thank you all for allowing me to be a part of this, and you can visit my website at kbdphd.com. Thank you, Dr. Malveaux.
Thank you, kbdphd.com. Okay, Damon, you want a last bite?
Sure. I just think P&G is proud to be a sponsor of this forum and continue this discussion. We recognize that, you know, equality is an active and not a passive activity. So, and it's something where everyone has a role to play. That's businesses, that's the private sector, that's government, that's individual citizens. So really what we're trying to do is to get everyone to step up and just progress along that path. If you're aware of what needs to be happening, become an advocate. If you're an advocate, become an activist, but move along that spectrum. There's a ton of resources that are out there. We've created a hub at pg.com/takeonrace, which is our equality initiative. And we've designed that as a hub with educational videos, reading lists, books to read, videos to watch, not only for you, but for people that you work with and in your family, to help them learn more about some of these issues in a very meaningful way, and then figure out how they too can step up and take action. But proud to be with all of you here tonight.
Well, we're happy to have you, and we're appreciative of the sponsorship. And we hope that you all will continue to take a leadership role in this equity issue, which many of your corporate peers have not chosen to take. So we're sure that you all will do some agitation there. So we have had an amazing conversation with some amazing panelists. It was great to have Senator Hank and Senator Booker, Congresswoman Lawrence, and Congressman Hank Johnson to open us up. The film from P&G was very provocative. I hope people can find that online as well. And we really opened up a can. We didn't solve anything, but we never do. We've raised questions for people to take a look at. What I would say in closing is that we must, first of all these folks have contributed phenomenally. So I'm very grateful to everyone for making my job really easy. But let me also say that let's not forget about what we mean when we talk about restorative. Let's not just talk about good public policy. Let's talk about making people whole. I would recommend that people go to ibw21.org to look at the National African American Reparations Commission and our 10-point program that talks about reparations. We're not talking about give you a check. We're talking about restoring our communities. Once upon a time, we had 123 Black-owned banks. Now we have 23. You know, we can just go back at everything we've lost, and we can talk about why we've lost it. So people, don't forget your history, and don't let other people try to get you to forget your history. Our history is a foundation for the work that we need to do going forward. And so let's not ever, ever forget Tulsa, Wilmington, North Carolina, Memphis, Tennessee, 5,000 lynchings. Let's not forget any of that. That gives us a roadmap to what we need to get to. And then finally, let's not forget to vote. Vote like your life depends on it, because guess what? It does. We have 110 environmental regulations rolled back, National Labor Relations Board, unappointed people. I could go down the list, but I won't, because I'm out of time. I made them stay on time, so I have to keep myself on time. But in any case, all I'm saying, please don't forget to vote. It's really important. We see what these people are trying to do. CBCF is nonpartisan. However, we know what the right thing is, and so just do the right thing. Thank you all again. Appreciate it.